Some men build their empires with mercy, others with teeth. Augustus Devereux did both, and in doing so, became a god in the glass and steel pantheon of New York City. The Wall Street Journal called him the Titan of Second Chances. The city's elite whispered his name like a prayer at their glittering charity galas. He was a myth in a bespoke suit, a man who built hospitals with one hand while crushing his competitors with the other. But prayers don't resurrect the dead. And I didn't come to his kingdom seeking a second chance. I came carrying a silence 20 years deep, a silence sharp enough to shatter the glass walls of his cathedral. My name is Juliette Beaumont, and my vengeance was not a sudden storm. It was a change in the climate, a slow, imperceptible drop in temperature that freezes a man's heart before he even realizes he's cold. Before I begin this confession, listen to me. This isn't just his story of a tragic downfall. This is my story of a meticulously engineered demolition. They will call me a villain, a snake, a monster in a navy dress. They might be right. But by the end of this, you will understand that I was not a choice he made. I was a consequence he had earned. My world was forged in the silence of a once great man. My father, Charles Beaumont, was an architect of a different era. He believed in foundations, in handshakes, in building doors for other men to walk through. His company, Beaumont Construction, was his life's work, a testament to the old ways of doing business, built on reputation, not leverage. He was a good man. And in the jungle of Manhattan real estate, good men are often the first to be eaten. Then came Augustus Devereux. He was younger, hungrier, a predator who saw the intricate web of laws not as a set of rules, but as a weapon. He didn't just build skyscrapers, he built intricate legal traps. He moved with a speed and ruthlessness the old guard couldn't comprehend. Bankers, charmed by his youth and ferocious ambition, extended lines of credit that were, in reality, gilded nooses. He weaponized timing, turning late fees into catastrophic lawsuits, turning friendly buy-in offers into hostile takeovers. He didn't break my father. He systematically dismantled him, piece by legal piece, until all that was left was a hollowed-out man sitting in a leather chair, listening to the silence where an empire used to be. The newspapers called it a changing of the guard, a classic story of an old lion being replaced by a younger, stronger one. They didn't print what I saw. I was 10 years old, clutching a stuffed rabbit with one bent ear, watching my father's light go out. He didn't shout or rage. He just sat there in a profound and terrifying stillness, as the life he had built was auctioned off and absorbed into the growing behemoth of the Devereux Group. They said a heart attack killed him a year later. They were wrong. Hope died first. His heart just had the decency to follow. That was the day my flaw was born, etched into the soul of a 10-year-old girl. I do not forgive men who bury their cruelty under the clean, acceptable name of competition. And in that moment, my goal crystallized into a diamond-hard point of purpose. I would spend the rest of my life preparing. I would learn his systems, his language, his strategies. And then, one day, I would walk through the front door of Augustus Devereux's empire, not as a conqueror, but as a loyal servant. And I would make him choke on the ghosts he thought he had buried. The Devereux Foundation Gala was the epitome of New York opulence, a symphony of champagne flutes, shallow laughter, and the rustle of couture. Politicians practiced their speeches on generosity, while their aides negotiated backroom deals. Socialites, their faces pulled tight with cosmetic perfection, compared the weight of the diamonds on their wrists. And in the center of it all, a vortex of quiet power, stood Augustus Devereux. He wore a simple navy suit, but it hung on him like armor. His temples were silver, his posture ramrod straight, the bearing of a man who had fought and won wars the rest of us would never even know existed. When my name was called as the final grant applicant, a hush fell over the room. I walked to the podium, a leather folder pressed to my chest like a shield. My dress was navy, my shoes were plain, my hair was pulled back in a severe knot. I was intentionally forgettable. Shadows don't announce their arrival. They simply appear when the light shifts. My mother used to say, I began, my voice clear and steady, devoid of theatrics, that a good system is like a woven basket. Intricate, strong. You don't notice the small, insignificant leaks until you pull it from the river and realize everything you were carrying is gone. I didn't speak of charity or hope. I spoke of systems. I laid out a simple, practical, and ruthlessly efficient model for eliminating scholarship fraud within his foundation. I used data, logic, and a deep, intuitive understanding of how people cheat when they think no one is watching. It was the culmination of a decade of study, a master's degree in finance, and a 5-year stint at a top auditing firm, all undertaken for this single moment. I built my entire career to be the key to a lock he didn't even know existed. The room, which had been restless, became still. When I finished, there was a beat of silence, and then a wave of genuine, impressed applause. But I wasn't watching the room. I was watching him. Augustus Devereux did not clap. He listened. He watched me with an unnerving intensity, the kind of focus that measures silence as if it were currency. He wasn't seeing a grant applicant. He was seeing a tool. Later, I found a quiet corner near a service corridor, the air thick with the smell of seared scallops and ambition. I was pretending to check my phone when his shadow fell over me. "Miss Beaumont." His voice was a low baritone, laced with the gravel of authority. "Mr. Devereux," I replied, my heart a cold, steady drum against my ribs. "Augustus," he corrected, a fatherly warmth softening his tone. It was a calculated move designed to disarm. "You have a mind that doesn't waste words. You see the leaks in the basket. I could use that." I feigned a hopeful naivety. "The grant would be a great honor, sir." He gave a small, almost imperceptible shake of his head. "No," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "Not a grant. A job." There it was. After 20 years of waiting in the dark, a door had finally opened. And the man who had destroyed my father was holding it open for me, a welcoming smile on his face. I had spent my life studying the architecture of his empire. Now he was inviting me inside to see it for myself. "So tell me, if your enemy hands you the key to his kingdom, mistaking your silence for servitude, is it a sin to accept? Or is it simply the first move in a game you were born to win?" Devereux Tower did not scrape the New York sky. It pierced it, a monolithic blade of dark glass and obsidian steel. It was less a building and more a declaration of war against the horizon itself. On my first day, I walked through its cavernous marble lobby, the air chilled to a precise temperature, smelling of money, ambition, and a faint antiseptic hint of lemon. This was the belly of the beast, the heart of the kingdom built on the ashes of my father's life. I felt no fear. I felt like I was coming home. My first obstacle was not the man himself, but his gatekeeper. Genevieve Croft, chief of staff for the Devereux Group, was a woman forged in the crucible of corporate warfare. She had sharp, intelligent eyes that missed nothing and a warm, disarming smile that was as beautiful as it was predatory. She greeted me in her office, a minimalist space with a panoramic view of Lower Manhattan. "Juliet," she said, her voice smooth as silk, "Augustus has been singing your praises. A mind that sees the leaks in the basket. It's quite the introduction." She let the implication hang in the air between us. "Who are you, and what do you really want?" I met her gaze without flinching, my own expression a mask of earnest sincerity. "I don't have an agenda, Ms. Croft. I have a skill set. Mr. Devereux saw a use for it. My only ambition is to prove him right. I didn't need her to trust me. I just needed her to be unable to prove I was untrustworthy." Augustus Devereux arrived at precisely 7:32 a.m. and administered his own test. "Miss Beaumont," he began, ignoring pleasantries, "tell me about your first significant failure." It was a brilliant question, a test of character. I chose the truth, framed as a lesson. I told him of a university project, a tutoring app with a perfect algorithm, but no tutors. "I built a beautiful, intricate door," I concluded, "but I forgot to build the house that went with it. Vision without execution is just a pleasant dream." His stern expression softened. "Good," he said, the word of final, definitive judgment. "We're aligned." He turned to Genevieve. "Give her whatever she needs. Level 4 security clearance." His ego was his greatest blind spot. He saw a reflection of his own youthful genius and failed to see the vengeful ghost standing right in front of him. The Department of Special Projects was a deliberately bland name for the company's internal audit unit. It was the perfect position for a spy. My hunt began with a patience that bordered on monastic. Vengeance is not a sprint. It is a marathon of 1,000 small, painful cuts. I started with the mundane. I found phantom vendors, procurement loops, billing scams. With each quiet, concise report, I saved the company millions. A mid-level manager would be fired here, a trusted executive quietly dismissed there. I asked for no credit. When praise was given, I deflected it. "I'm just following the data," I'd say. My performance was flawless. Augustus was delighted. He started taking me on site visits. One afternoon, at a community health clinic his foundation had funded, he turned to me, his expression uncharacteristically soft. "You have a gift, Juliet," he said. "You see the grand vision, but you never lose sight of the people on the ground. You make me better. You remind me of the man I wanted to be when I started all this." His words were like acid in my veins. "The man you wanted to be?" I thought, my hand clenching into a fist in my lap. "The man you wanted to be didn't drive my father into an early grave." I simply smiled and said, "I'm just trying to live up to the opportunity you've given me, sir." That night, in my small apartment, my war room, I wrote in my diary, "He believes he is mentoring me. He does not understand that I am not here to learn how to build. I am here to learn exactly where to place the demolition charges. Patience is the armor of the vengeful." For 6 months, I wore it every day. I became a fixture in the silent, pressurized ecosystem of the Devereux Tower's executive floor. I was the company's ghost, the one who would appear, solve a multimillion-dollar inefficiency, and vanish back into obscurity. Trust is a currency, and I was patiently accumulating a vast fortune. Augustus now treated me as his personal oracle. He believed he was honing my mind, shaping me into a younger version of himself. He had no idea he was merely sharpening the blade that I would one day press to his throat. My first strike had to be precise, a surgeon's cut, not a butcher's blow. I found the perfect wound buried in the archives, the Hudson Ascendant Project. It was a glittering residential tower he championed personally, a monument to his victory built on the very bones of my father's company. The land had been acquired 22 years ago through the aggressive legal maneuvers that had bankrupted Beaumont Construction. A full-scale exposé would be too loud too soon. I needed to create a tremor, not an earthquake. I spent a week compiling a small, exquisitely curated dossier. A few key pages from the original land seizure lawsuit, an internal memo questioning the project's financial viability, and an anonymous analyst's report suggesting the building's foundation was not up to code. A lie, but a plausible and terrifying one. I laundered the information through the digital underworld, the anonymous tip culminating at a small, ferocious financial blog called The Vulture's Quill. The article dropped on a Tuesday morning. The headline was a masterpiece of insinuation. Cracks in the foundation? Questions swirl around Devereux's Hudson Jewel. The effect was immediate. The company's stock dipped a modest but insulting 3 points. It was a paper cut, but it was a paper cut on the face of a god, and everyone noticed. I was in the morning strategy meeting when the news broke. Augustus glanced at his phone, and his face hardened into a mask of cold fury. "We have a leak," he announced, his voice dangerously quiet. "I want it found. I want the source identified, and I want them ruined." Genevieve Croft orchestrated the internal investigation with the efficiency of a field marshal. The paranoia in the tower was thick enough to taste. My own interview was a masterclass in performance. I expressed shock and professional outrage. Then came the moment I had been preparing for. "I need your help, Juliet," Genevieve said. "Your mind sees patterns others miss. I want you to join the investigation." The irony was exquisite. They were inviting the arsonist to help investigate the fire. For the next week, I worked alongside the forensic team, using my knowledge of the system to point them down blind alleys. I subtly built a case against a perfect scapegoat, a disgruntled vice president from a rival firm. I planted digital breadcrumbs that would, if discovered, point directly to an external breach. During this time, Augustus became more reliant on me than ever. "It isn't the money," he said late one evening, the weight of the betrayal pressing down on him. "It's the loyalty. You build something, you give people your trust, and they repay you with a knife in the back." He looked at me, his eyes filled with a tired, paternal warmth. "I trust you, Juliet. Your loyalty is a rare thing in this business." My loyalty, I thought, the words a silent, bitter laugh in my mind, is to a ghost you don't even have the decency to remember. Outwardly, I just nodded. "I won't let you down, sir." The investigation concluded a week later. My fabricated evidence was discovered. The official narrative was set, corporate sabotage. But something had changed. A seed of paranoia was now planted in the heart of Augustus Devereux. And I, the loyal protégé who had helped him hunt the traitor in his own house, was now more trusted than ever. So tell me, when you earn your enemy's absolute trust, is that the moment before the battle begins, or is that the victory itself? The aftermath of a successful deception is a quiet, intoxicating thing. In the weeks following the sabotage incident, the paranoia I had seeded in Augustus Devereux's mind began to bloom like a beautiful, toxic flower. He saw rivals in every shadow and traitors in every friendly smile. And in this new, uncertain world, He clung to the one person he believed had proven her loyalty beyond question, me. My status within the empire underwent a seismic shift. I was elevated to a newly created role, special advisor to the CEO. The title was vague, but its power was absolute. I became his confidant, his internal auditor, his executioner. My new mandate, given to me by Augustus himself, was to conduct a full, deep-dive review of the company's historical acquisitions and partnerships. The official reason was to identify any old vulnerabilities that a rival could exploit. The real reason was that Augustus needed to soothe his own paranoia. He had given the fox the keys to the henhouse and tasked her with ensuring its security. The irony was so profound it was almost poetic. He saw it as a shield. I saw it as a sword. With my new authority, I no longer had to tiptoe through the corporate structure. I could stride through it, demanding access to the deepest, most forgotten corners of the Devereaux empire. My target was not the gleaming, modern servers in the tower's sub-basement. My target was the digital graveyard, a decommissioned off-site data archive in a climate-controlled warehouse in New Jersey. It was here, amongst the ghosts of old operating systems and obsolete file formats, that the company's true history was stored. It was here that Augustus had buried his sins. The work was a descent into a digital catacomb. For weeks, I spent my days playing the part of the loyal advisor in Manhattan, and my nights and weekends in a secure, windowless room, sifting through terabytes of old data. It was a painstaking process of virtual archaeology. I unearthed decade-old acquisition files, sealed court depositions, and encrypted internal memos from the company's ruthless ascent in the late 90s and early 2000s. A pattern began to emerge from the digital dust. It was a brutal, repetitive, and brilliant methodology of destruction. My father, I realized with a cold, sickening clarity, was not an anomaly. He was a single chapter in a long and bloody book. Augustus Devereaux hadn't risen to power through innovation or superior strategy alone. He had risen by preying on the weak. His method was a three-act tragedy he performed over and over. Act 1, the friendly offer. He would identify a smaller, family-owned company with valuable assets, often one going through a temporary financial strain. He would approach them with a generous offer of a partnership or a partial buy-in, positioning himself as a savior. Act 2, the legal garrote. Once inside, he would use his army of lawyers to find or create a contractual breach. He would tie the company up in endless, ruinously expensive litigation, bleeding them dry, all while his PR machine painted him as the victim of a partnership gone wrong. Act 3, the vulture's feast. With the smaller company on the brink of bankruptcy, its owner broken and exhausted, he would sweep in and buy out their remaining assets, including their debt, for pennies on the dollar. It was a perfect, legal, and utterly soulless machine for devouring his rivals. And I found them all, a litany of ghosts in the machine. A family-owned shipping company from Staten Island, a promising biotech firm from Queens, a legendary publishing house from the Village. Dozens of them, all reduced to forgotten names in an archive, their legacies and life's work absorbed into the ever-expanding mass of the Devereaux Group. Immersing myself in this history took a toll. I stopped sleeping. The names of the families he'd ruined became a mantra in my mind. I'd see the face of my own father, sitting in his silent study, superimposed on the stories of these other men. But this journey into the past did not soften me. It did not fill me with a desire for simple justice. It calcified my resolve into something harder and more absolute than I could have ever imagined. My mission was no longer just for my father. It was for all of them. I was no longer a daughter seeking vengeance. I was an avenger for a generation of ghosts. The ultimate prize, the heart of this digital darkness, remained elusive. I knew there had to be a central repository, a place where he kept his own private thoughts, his true strategy. Augustus was too arrogant, too much of a student of history, not to keep a record of his own conquests. After weeks of searching, I found a ghost partition on the oldest server, a section of the drive that was hidden from any normal directory. It was protected by a single, elegant password prompt. For 3 days, I was stumped. I tried everything: his mother's maiden name, his birthday, the name of his first company. Nothing worked. The system threatened a permanent data wipe after 5 failed attempts. I had one guess left. I stopped thinking about data and started thinking about the man. What was the one thing that truly drove him? It wasn't money. It wasn't power. It was legacy. He saw himself as a historical figure, a Carnegie or a Rockefeller. He was an architect of empires. And who was the most famous and infamous architect of an empire in history? I typed in the password Caesar. Access granted. The folder opened, and my breath caught in my chest. It was a collection of private, password-protected journals. It was his ledger of sins. For the next several hours, I read. It was his unfiltered voice, filled with contempt for his rivals, justification for his methods, and a cold, clear-eyed narration of his victories. And then I found the entry I had been searching for my entire life. The chapter on Beaumont construction. He wrote of my father not as a rival, but as an obstacle, a relic of a bygone era. Charles Beaumont, he wrote, builds with honor. It is a commendable but fatal flaw. He believes in the sanctity of a handshake in a world that demands the ironclad certainty of a lawsuit. He is a dinosaur admiring a meteor, and I am the meteor. He detailed every step of his plan to dismantle my father's company, the same three-act tragedy he had performed on so many others. He wrote of the final meeting, where my father, financially broken, had finally agreed to be bought out. He did not rage, Augustus wrote. He simply sat in silence. A respectable, but ultimately ineffective, way to die. His empire is now a footnote in mine. That is the way of the world. Strong things break weak things. Reading those words, the cold, dispassionate epitaph he had written for my father's life, did not make me want to cry. It made my vision go clear. The last vestiges of the frightened little girl with the stuffed rabbit burned away, leaving behind the cold, hard certainty of the woman I had become. The hunt was over. I had it. His confession. The proof that his actions were not just ambitious, but malicious. This was the weapon that could not only bring down his company, but could annihilate the myth of Augustus Devereux itself. My goal, once a hazy desire for revenge, was now a crystalline point of light. I would not leak this. I would not use it to wound him. I would use it to publicly execute him. I would make him read his own words to the world. I would make his legacy a monument to his own cruelty. I copied the entire ledger onto a secured, encrypted drive. As the progress bar completed, I leaned back in my chair in the silent, cold warehouse, the ghost of my father at my side. The first phase of my war was over. I had found the truth. Now I would turn that truth into a fire. So tell me, when you uncover a truth so toxic it can burn down an empire, is it your duty to bury it, or is it your destiny to light the match? Possessing the truth is a heavy and terrible thing. In the days after I copied Augustus Devereux's secret ledger, the encrypted drive I carried felt less like a collection of data and more like a captured black hole, a dense, silent mass of gravity that warped the world around me. I had the weapon. I had the irrefutable proof of his cruelty, written in his own arrogant, unapologetic hand. The question was no longer what I would do, but how. A simple, anonymous leak to the press suddenly felt crude, insufficient. It would create a storm, yes, but it would be an impersonal one. My vengeance was not impersonal. It was a debt of blood, and it required a public, theatrical, and deeply personal collection. I wanted to see the light go out in his eyes, not just read about his company's stock price falling. I needed a stage, a platform, a moment so perfectly engineered that it would not only destroy his empire, but annihilate the very myth of the man himself. I began to study the corporate calendar, searching for the perfect venue for an execution. I was so consumed with planning my final act that I failed to notice I was being watched. My own quiet, meteoric rise, coupled with the recent internal turmoil, had not gone unnoticed by the other predators in the corporate jungle. I had assumed they were all loyal subjects of the king. I had failed to account for the bitter jealousies of a royal court. The approach came from the last person I expected. Julian Croft was a relic of the old guard, a senior board member who had been with the company since its early days. He was a man of old money and quiet influence, one of the few who had known Augustus before he became a god. In board meetings, he was a creature of quiet observation, his contributions minimal but always insightful. I had dismissed him as a passive elder statesman. It was a grave miscalculation. He requested a meeting not through our assistants, but by approaching me directly in the hushed, art-filled hallway outside my office. "Miss Beaumont," he said, his voice a dry, patrician rustle. "A moment of your time, if you would." He was a tall, stooped man with eyes that were a pale, watery blue, but they held a shrewdness that decades of corporate warfare had honed to a fine point. "I am a member at the Century Club. A quiet place for a quiet conversation. I would be honored if you would join me for a drink this evening." It was not a request. It was a summons. The Century Club was a bastion of New York's old establishment, a place where the real, unspoken business of the city was conducted over scotch and cigars. I knew this was not a social call. That evening, I entered the club's hallowed wood-paneled halls. The air was thick with the scent of leather, history, and privilege. Julian Croft was waiting for me in a secluded corner of the library, surrounded by shelves of priceless books. He gestured to the armchair opposite him. "Thank you for coming, Juliet," he said, a tumbler of amber liquid in his hand. "I've been watching you. Your ascent has been remarkable. Mr. Devereux has given me a great deal of opportunity," I said, my voice neutral, offering him nothing. He smiled, a thin, bloodless gesture. "Augustus has a talent for finding brilliant tools. He is, however, less talented at imagining those tools might have a will of their own." He took a slow sip of his drink, his pale eyes studying me over the rim of the glass. "He's become paranoid since that business with the leak. He sees enemies everywhere. And perhaps, for the first time in his life, he's not wrong." This was the opening. He was laying his cards on the table, inviting me to show mine. I remained silent, a mask of polite confusion on my face. My silence was a vacuum, forcing him to speak, to reveal his intentions. "Some of us on the board," he continued, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper, "have become concerned. Augustus has always been a ruthless man. It is the source of his genius. But his recent instability is a threat to the empire he built. An empire, I might add, that many of us helped him build." The resentment in his voice was a low, bitter hum. He was a man who had spent 40 years in the shadow of a king and was tired of the darkness. "He trusts you, Juliet," Julian said, leaning forward. "He has given you more access and more power in 6 months than he has given men who have served him for 30 years. He sees you as his protege, his successor, perhaps. But what happens when his paranoia turns on you? What happens when the king decides his most trusted advisor is a threat?" He let the question hang in the air. He was a master of insinuation. He wasn't accusing me of being the original saboteur. He was positioning himself as a potential protector, a wise old hand offering guidance to the brilliant newcomer. "What is it you want, Julian?" I asked, my voice cold and direct, forgoing the pretense. His smile widened slightly. He appreciated the directness. "A change in leadership," he said simply. "Augustus Devereux is a legend. But legends belong in history books, not in the chairman's seat. He will never step down willingly. He would need to be pushed by a unanimous board. And a board will not act on paranoia. They need a reason. Something concrete. Something unforgivable." And there it was. The twist I never saw coming. My solitary, sacred quest for vengeance was about to be co-opted by a grubby, common corporate coup. Julian Croft didn't know who I was, or what I had. But he suspected I was the key. He had seen the smoke from my small fire, and had come to offer me a barrel of gasoline. My mind raced, the cold logic that had guided me for years kicking into overdrive. This was a contamination of my mission. My father's memory was not a tool to be used by men like Julian Croft to settle their petty grievances and seize power. My vengeance was pure, personal, and absolute. And yet the pragmatist in me, the part of me that had spent years studying systems, saw the undeniable logic of his offer. I was a lone wolf. I could release the ledger, and it would destroy Augustus. But the board, in an act of self-preservation, might circle the wagons, dismiss it as a forgery, and paint me as a disgruntled employee. I could win the battle of public opinion, but lose the war for the company. Julian and his faction, he hinted at 3 other senior members, could give my attack legitimacy from within. They could ensure that when I struck, the blow would be final and absolute. He was offering me a Faustian bargain. If I accepted, I would be trading the purity of my revenge for the certainty of its success. I would be using their greed, just as they intended to use my anger. For the first time, I had to ask myself, what did I truly want? Did I want to be a martyr for my father's memory? Or did I want to stand on the rubble of Augustus Devereux's legacy, no matter who helped me push? The answer was as clear as it was cold. I wanted to win. I looked across the table at the old, bitter man and saw him not as an ally, but as a weapon. A tool. The same way he saw me. "The kind of evidence you're talking about," I said slowly, carefully, "would have to be ironclad. Something that strikes at the very heart of who Augustus is, at the myth he has built." Julian's eyes lit up. He knew I had it. "If such evidence were to find its way into the right hands," he whispered, "those hands would know exactly what to do with it. The person who provided it would be seen not as a traitor, but as a savior of the company. And they would be rewarded accordingly." I did not smile. I simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. I would not show him the ledger. Not yet. I would give him just enough to secure his loyalty. I was no longer a solitary ghost. I was now the reluctant leader of a silent, bloodless conspiracy. As I left the club and walked into the cool night air, the weight of the encrypted drive in my bag felt different. It was no longer just the key to my personal vengeance. It was now the key to a kingdom, and there were other players who wanted to help me turn it. So tell me, to destroy a monster, is it a betrayal of your cause to align yourself with other monsters? Or in a war of shadows, does it matter whose knife you use, as long as it strikes the intended heart? The alliance with Julian Croft was a pact made in shadow, a handshake between my pure, cold vengeance and his grubby, common greed. I walked away from the Century Club that night not as a compromised idealist, but as a pragmatist who had just been handed a new and powerful weapon. My mission had not been tainted, it had been amplified. Julian and his faction of bitter old men saw me as their key, their silver bullet. They had no idea I saw them as the delivery system for a bomb I had built myself. They wanted a coup. I wanted an immolation. I would give them their coup, and in the ensuing chaos, I would strike the match. I did not make them wait long. A predator, once it joins a pack, must prove its worth. 2 days after our meeting, I arranged for a package to be delivered to Julian's private residence. It was not the entire ledger. One does not hand a cannon to a foot soldier. I extracted a single, perfectly chosen chapter. The story of the hostile takeover of a small but innovative tech firm from the early 2000s. The firm's founder, a brilliant engineer named Michael Chun, had been a personal friend of another long-serving board member, a man named Lawrence Hayes, who had never fully trusted Augustus. The documents I selected were surgical. They included Augustus's private journal entries, where he referred to Chun as a naive academic and detailed his strategy to bleed him out with patent lawsuits before seizing his company. It was a story of profound intellectual and financial cruelty. I packaged it, encrypted it, and sent it to Julian with a simple, untraceable message. A taste of the truth. Use it wisely. The effect was instantaneous and exactly as I had designed. This was not a public leak. This was an internal detonation. Julian, armed with this proof, convened a secret meeting with his faction and the undecided Lawrence Hayes. The story of Michael Chen's ruin, told in Augustus's own words, was the catalyst that solidified their conspiracy. The whispers of discontent turned into a unified, focused plot. The first tremor of this new war reached me through the board's official channels. An emergency, closed-door ethics committee meeting was called, chaired by Julian Croft. Augustus was not invited. The official reason was a review of historical acquisition protocols. The real reason was to put the king on trial in his own castle, without his knowledge. The chaos that followed was a beautifully orchestrated symphony of my own composition. The internal leak created a schism in the board that fractured the company's leadership. On one side were Julian's insurgents, now armed with a righteous, evidence-backed fury. On the other were the loyalists, led by the ever-watchful Genevieve Croft, who saw the move as a treacherous power grab. And in the middle were the terrified neutrals, who saw the impending civil war and wanted only to survive. My role in this drama was my most complex and dangerous performance yet. I was playing two characters at once. To Julian and his conspirators, I was the unseen hand, the shadowy oracle known only as the Source. I communicated with him through encrypted channels, feeding him strategic advice. Do not move for a vote of no confidence yet, I instructed. You must let the poison spread. Let the evidence create doubt in the minds of the others. Make them question everything they thought they knew about the man they serve. But to Augustus and Genevieve, I was the loyal and brilliant advisor, working tirelessly to unmask the traitors who were tearing the company apart. I was a fixture in the official war room they established to combat the leak. I sat at the table as Augustus raged, his face a mask of thunderous fury. "This is Julian," he snarled, slamming his fist on the table. "That bitter old fossil. He's been waiting 40 years for a chance to put a knife in my back." "We have no proof it was him, Augustus," Genevieve countered, her voice calm and steady as always. The documents were circulated anonymously. "It could be anyone." "It was him," he roared. And in that moment, I saw the true genius of my plan. By planting the seed through Julian, I had made Augustus's paranoia focus entirely on his old rival. He was so consumed with the idea of Julian's betrayal that he never once thought to look at the quiet, unassuming woman sitting at his right hand. I used my position in that war room to devastating effect. I was a double agent at the heart of the empire. When Genevieve would devise a strategy to identify the leak's origin, I would find a subtle flaw in it, ensuring the investigation would fail. When Augustus planned a countermove to consolidate support from the neutral board members, I would anonymously tip off Julian, allowing him to anticipate and neutralize the effort. I was a ghost, haunting both sides of the conflict, ensuring they remained locked in a perfect state of mutually assured destruction. My boldest and most cruel move was yet to come. To win this war, I needed Augustus to be completely isolated. And his last, most formidable shield was Genevieve Croft. Her loyalty was a fortress. I could not breach it with evidence or accusations. So I decided to poison it with doubt. I waited for the right moment. It came late one night, after a particularly brutal day of infighting. Augustus was in his office, exhausted and demoralized. I brought him a glass of scotch. "She's loyal to a fault, isn't she?" I said quietly, gesturing vaguely towards Genevieve's empty office. "Genevieve? She's the best there is," he said, his voice thick with weariness. "The only one in this nest of vipers I can still trust completely." "I know," I said, my voice a soft symphony of feigned concern. "But sometimes, Augustus, sometimes that kind of old-fashioned loyalty can be a blind spot. She's known Julian and Lawrence for decades. She sees them as old colleagues, not as the threats they've become. Her loyalty might be to the idea of the board, to the institution, not to the difficult decisions a king must make to protect his throne." I let the words hang in the air. I had not accused her of anything. I had simply reframed her greatest strength, her loyalty, as a potential weakness. I was planting a seed, a tiny, insidious doubt that would make him question the one person he believed was unshakable. She would never betray me," he said, but for the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his voice. "I hope you're right, sir," I said, and left him there alone with his thoughts and his drink. The next morning, I saw the effect. I watched on the security feed as he and Genevieve had their morning briefing. The easy camaraderie was gone. He was more formal, more distant. He was watching her, questioning her. The poison was working. The king was beginning to doubt his last defender. He was becoming an island. I stood at the center of the web, every strand vibrating with the chaos I had created. The company was at war with itself. The board was fractured. The king was alone, surrounded by enemies he could see and won, far more dangerous, that he could not. Julian's faction was growing bolder, hungry for the final weapon I had promised them. Augustus was becoming more erratic, his paranoia consuming his judgment. It was time to prepare the stage for the final act. So tell me, to truly conquer a king, must you storm his castle with an army? Or is it enough to simply make him believe he is utterly and completely alone inside its walls, while you hand the key to his enemies? The Devereux Group had become a labyrinth of mirrors. In the weeks leading up to the annual Foundation Gala, the tower was a place of oppressive silence and frantic, whispered conversations. Augustus, now fully in the grip of his paranoia, had turned his office into a bunker. His trust in Genevieve Croft was a shattered thing. He treated her with a cold, formal distance, second-guessing her advice and excluding her from his most sensitive decisions. He was a king who suspected his own shadow. The only person he seemed to trust, the only person whose counsel he sought, was me. I had become his sole confidant. I was his strategist, his sounding board, and his shield against the perceived betrayals of his oldest allies. I would sit with him for hours as he raged against Julian Croft and the vultures on his board, all the while feeding his paranoia with subtle, carefully placed words of affirmation. "You have to be careful who you trust, Augustus," I would say, my voice a symphony of loyalty. "A long history doesn't guarantee a loyal heart." He was a drowning man, and I was the one holding his head beneath the water, all while whispering words of reassurance. Meanwhile, Julian Croft and his faction of insurgents were growing impatient. They saw the chaos, they saw Augustus's increasing isolation, and they were hungry for the final kill. Julian's encrypted messages to me became more frequent, more demanding. "The time is now. We need the final weapon you promised. The board is ready to act." They were right. The time had come. I needed a stage for the final act, a place of maximum visibility and poetic justice. The choice was obvious. The Devereux Foundation Gala. The very event where a quiet, unassuming woman named Juliette Beaumont had first appeared a year ago, speaking of leeks in woven baskets. It was the night he had opened the door for me. It was only fitting that it would be the night I would seal his tomb. I arranged one last meeting with Julian at the Century Club. I arrived carrying a simple, elegant leather portfolio. Inside was not the full ledger. I would never entrust him with that much power, but a curated masterpiece of corporate assassination. It was a 40-page dossier, printed on heavy, watermarked paper, detailing 3 of Augustus's most brutal takeovers. It included the full, unredacted story of Michael Chun, which would solidify the loyalty of Lawrence Hayes. And at its heart, the chapter that would serve as the public's entry point into the scandal, a heavily redacted but still unmistakable account of the ruin of Beaumont Construction. On the final page was a single, explosive document, a copy of the journal entry where Augustus had called my father a dinosaur admiring a meteor. I slid the portfolio across the polished table. Julian opened it, his pale eyes scanning the pages. "My God," he whispered, looking up at me with a new, profound respect. "This is definitive." "It is," I said, my voice cold. "And it is to be used precisely as I instruct. This is not a weapon for a boardroom squabble. This is for a public execution." I laid out the plan. A 3-phase attack. In the 48 hours before the gala, he and his faction would privately circulate the dossier among the remaining neutral board members, securing their proxy votes. Phase 2 would take place during the gala itself. I had identified a journalist from the Vulture's Quill. Julian's job was to give him an advance copy of the Beaumont Construction section and a single, scripted question. "And Phase 3? Julian asked. "Phase 3, I said, is me." While I armed his enemies, I was also meticulously preparing the victim for the slaughter. I spent the week of the gala by Augustus's side, helping him draft his keynote speech. It was a symphony of irony. I filled it with soaring rhetoric about integrity, about trust, about the enduring power of legacy. At one point, as we were refining a sentence about building on a foundation of honor, he stopped and looked at me, his eyes filled with a weary, genuine gratitude. "I don't know what I would do without you, Juliet," he said. "You've been a rock in all this chaos." I met his gaze, my own expression a perfect, unreadable mask. "I am simply repaying the faith you showed in me, Augustus." The moment almost felt human. I saw not the monster, but a tired, aging man betrayed by his friends. I acknowledged the flicker of empathy, and then I extinguished it. My father had been a tired, aging man too, and this man had shown him no mercy. The grand ballroom of the plaza was a universe unto itself, a swirling galaxy of old money and new power. Augustus Devereux stood at the podium, bathed in the warm, forgiving light of the stage, and he was the sun at its center. He was magnificent. His voice, a rich and confident baritone, filled the cavernous space, the words I had written for him flowing from his lips like gospel. I stood in the wings, just out of the main spotlight, a shadow in navy silk. Around my neck, I wore a small silver rabbit charm, its one ear bent. It was no longer a memento. Tonight, it was a declaration. I watched the rapt faces in the crowd. They saw a king. I saw a man delivering his own eulogy. He reached the crescendo of his speech. "A legacy is not built with steel and glass," he declared. "It is built on a foundation of trust. It is a promise made to the future." The room was poised to erupt in thunderous applause. This was the moment. From the center of the room, a voice, sharp and clear, cut through the reverent silence. "Mr. Devereux." It was the young journalist. "Is it true," his voice boomed, "that the foundation of your own empire was built on the ruin of Beaumont Construction, a company you methodically drove into bankruptcy 20 years ago to seize its assets?" The name, my father's name, spoken aloud. The effect was the instant and absolute cessation of all sound. I watched the color drain from Augustus's face. He looked for the first time like a small and deeply vulnerable man. He was about to stammer a denial. I did not give him the chance. This was my cue. I stepped forward from the shadows, the click of my heels the only sound in the universe. I walked to the secondary microphone. I did not raise my voice. I spoke with the profound and unshakable calm of a truth that has waited too long to be told. "He will tell you it was competition," I said, my voice echoing through the silent hall. "The truth is, it was cruelty." A gasp rippled through the audience. "My name," I continued, my gaze never leaving his, "is Juliet Beaumont. Charles Beaumont was my father." The ballroom exploded. It was a chaotic symphony of murmurs and the percussive machine gun fire of 100 camera shutters. Augustus stared at me, his face a mask of dawning, horrified comprehension. He wasn't just looking at his trusted advisor. He was looking at the little girl with the stuffed rabbit. He was seeing the ghost. In that moment of maximum chaos, Julian Croft rose to his feet. He was followed by Lawrence Hayes, and then two others. They did not speak. They simply turned and began to walk out of the ballroom. It was a silent, brutal, and exquisitely public vote of no confidence. His allies were abandoning him. His legacy was in flames. And in the middle of it all, for one eternal second, his eyes met mine. He saw it all. He understood in that final, soul-crushing moment that his downfall was not an accident or an attack. It was a masterpiece of vengeance, and he had personally commissioned it. I held his gaze for a moment longer. Then I turned and walked off the stage, my purpose fulfilled. I left Augustus Devereux alone, a king without a kingdom, a myth without a believer, blinking in the merciless, unending flash of the cameras. So tell me, did I kill the man? Or did I simply hold up a mirror and let the entire world see the monster he had hidden for 20 years? Is that vengeance, or is it merely the truth arriving, fashionably late? Victory is not a roar, it is a profound and sudden silence. In the days that followed the gala, the world was a screaming chaos of my own making. My face was on the cover of every magazine, my name a trending hashtag that became a global synonym for justice. I was the giant slayer, the whisper that had toppled a titan, the woman who had walked into the heart of an empire and held up a mirror to its rotten core. The media storm was a hurricane of speculation and sanctimonious praise. They called me a hero. They called me a visionary. They did not understand that I was simply a daughter who had kept a promise. I watched the storm from the quiet of my small, anonymous apartment, the television muted. The noise of the world's applause was a distant, irrelevant frequency. I had spent 20 years consumed by a singular, burning purpose. Now that the fire had consumed its fuel, I was left in the cold, silent dark, surrounded by the ashes of the man I had destroyed and the woman I had become to do it. The corporate fallout was swift and merciless, precisely as I had planned. Augustus Devereux resigned from the board of his own company less than 24 hours after the gala. He issued a single written statement, a ghost-written apology that felt as hollow as the man himself. Then he vanished. He retreated from the city, from public life, from the world he had once commanded. His name, once a symbol of untouchable power, was now a permanent stain. Julian Croft and his faction of insurgents seized control of the Devereux Group in the ensuing power vacuum. The day after Augustus's resignation, Julian called me. His voice was thick with triumph and condescension. "You did it, Juliet," he said. "A masterpiece. The board is ours. We are prepared to offer you the position of Chief Strategy Officer. A 7-figure salary. A seat at the table. Your reward." I listened to him, a bitter taste filling my mouth. A seat at the table. He still saw me as a pawn, a tool to be rewarded and now controlled. He thought my vengeance was merely a brutal form of ambition. He, like Augustus, had fundamentally misunderstood me. "No, thank you, Julian," I said, my voice quiet and calm. There was a stunned silence on the other end of the line. "What? Don't be a fool. This is the victory. This is what we fought for." "You fought for a corner office, Julian," I replied, the words dripping with a coldness that cut through the phone line. "I fought for a ghost. We are not the same." Before he could respond, I hung up. That evening, I executed the final, quiet phase of my plan. I released the entire unredacted ledger of sins to a consortium of investigative journalists. Not just the chapters on my father or Michael Chun, but all of it. The chapters that detailed the quiet complicity of Julian Croft in an early, unethical takeover. The memos that implicated Lawrence Hayes in a stock manipulation scheme from a decade ago. All of their sins. All of their secrets. My war was never with the company. It was with the man. But the company was his legacy, and I would leave it to the vultures to pick its bones clean. I had no interest in ruling over an empire of echoes. My work was done. Weeks passed. The city's noise moved on to new scandals. I remained in my apartment, dismantling my war room, taking down the charts and timelines until the walls were bare. The silence was absolute. The rage that had been my constant companion for 2 decades was gone, and I was left with a profound and terrifying emptiness. Vengeance, I discovered, is a purpose, and without it, I was simply a woman in a quiet room. A letter arrived one morning. It was handwritten on simple, plain stationery. It was from him, the old factory site, where it began. One final conversation. I should have thrown it away. I should have burned it. But the silence in my life was too loud, and curiosity is a ghost of its own. I went. The site of my father's old business was a wasteland of cracked concrete and stubborn weeds, a monument to ruin. He was standing by the rusted front gate, a place where he had once stood in triumph. He was not the titan I had destroyed. He was just a man, stooped and gray, dressed in a simple coat against the autumn chill. He looked smaller, worn away by the truth. He didn't look at me as I approached. He stared at the ruins. "This is where I broke him," he said, his voice a hoarse whisper. I told myself it was just business, a necessary act of creation, that I was building something better on the bones of the past. He finally turned to me, his eyes clear for the first time, stripped of all arrogance and artifice. I was wrong. I was just a man who enjoyed the simple, brutal act of breaking things. My throat was tight. I had rehearsed 1,000 triumphant speeches for this moment, and now, all I could feel was a vast, desolate emptiness. "Was it worth it, Juliet?" he asked, his question genuine, not accusatory. "You have your justice. The world knows my sins. My name is Ash. Are you at peace?" "No," I whispered, the confession torn from a place deep inside me I didn't know existed. "I'm not." "I didn't think so," he said with a sad, knowing nod. "Vengeance is a fire. It keeps you warm for a time. It gives you light in the dark. But when it burns out, you realize it has also burned away everything else. Your past, your future. You are left alone in the ashes." He looked at me, a man looking at his own reflection in the architect of his ruin. "Don't let my sins be the anchor that holds you here, in this place of ghosts. Your father was a builder. Go and build something." He turned and walked away, a stooped, gray man disappearing into the gray afternoon. I never saw him again. I stood there for a long time, in the place where my life had been broken and remade. I thought I had won, but I had not resurrected my father. I had not healed the 10-year-old girl. I had simply proven that I could be as ruthless as the man I hated. I had silenced an empire, but the silence inside me was now deeper than ever before. Some victories taste of ash. Some triumphs leave you emptier than defeat. And in the quiet after the storm, I finally understood the ledger I had truly been trying to balance. Justice without mercy is just a more elegant form of violence. Vengeance may win the war, but it can never bring you peace. My name is Juliette Beaumont. I am the woman who brought down a king. I am the woman who now has to figure out what to do with the silence that follows. So I ask you, my jury, my confessor, one last time. I won. He lost. The ledger is balanced. But when you spend your entire life becoming a sword, what do you do when there is no one left to kill?